It was a cold rain. Water slid off the old eaves, each drop landing on my wet shoes. I stood in the middle of the living room once full of laughter, now echoing only my son's voice. "If you won't go to a nursing home, pack your things and get out of my house." My son said it without looking up from his phone. Next to him, my daughter-in-law stood with her arms crossed, lips pressed in annoyance. "We need a pleasant atmosphere for tonight's dinner, you understand?" I looked around. The family photos on the wall seemed to mock me. The woman who spent her life building this home, now thrown out of it like excess baggage. No one saw me off. No one said goodbye. Only the sound of rain and the cold smell of floor cleaner. I turned away, pulled my old phone from my pocket, and texted a number I hadn't used in a long time. Just a single letter, S. 5 minutes later, a low-engine hum stopped at the gate. My son froze and finally looked up from his screen. The glide of luxury tires over gravel seemed to freeze the room. The driver opened the door and bowed. "Mrs. Helen Montgomery? Mr. Samuel Drake invites you to the car." I pulled my suitcase and smiled faintly. "Looks like the nursing home I'm going to is fancier than you thought." I left in the rain, and that very night, the lives of those ungrateful people began to change course. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Helen Montgomery, 67 years old. I was born and raised in Oregon, where winter always smells like damp wood and maple leaves rotting underfoot. I used to think I understood happiness, a roof overhead, a loving husband, and a child who knew how to say thank you. Turns out some lessons only age can teach, like how people's hearts change faster than the weather. After my husband died, this house was all I had left. I planted flowers on the porch, hung family photos on the wall, and lived on memories of warmer years. I wasn't wealthy, and I didn't need luxury. I just wanted a quiet corner to finish out my life. But when Evan and Brooke moved in, everything changed. Their eyes weren't family anymore. They were the eyes of landlords looking at an overstaying tenant. I still remember how it felt when they told me I should go to a nursing home, soft like a suggestion, heavy like a sentence. While the rain pounded the eaves, I realized sometimes being thrown out isn't an ending. It's the start of a freedom you've forgotten for too long. When the limo door closed behind me, I leaned back in the seat, cool air from the window brushing my cheek. The smell of new leather mixed with rain, strange but peaceful. The rain kept a steady rhythm, and in that moment I knew I was leaving everything behind: the hurt, the shame, and the house that was no longer a home. Before I left, I quietly went upstairs and packed a few essentials: the wool scarf my mother knit when I was a young girl, a few changes of clothes, my old dog-eared Bible, and a small wooden box holding letters yellowed by time. Inside were the letters my husband Thomas sent from the war, and the single letter from Samuel Drake, the man I never forgot, even after 40 years apart. My hands trembled folding clothes, but my heart was oddly calm. Evan stood in the doorway, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just want you to have better care. There are doctors there, people to talk to." I looked at him, the son I once lulled to sleep, cooked for, taught his first letters. His eyes were cold now, mirroring back a mother he saw as a burden. Brooke, my daughter-in-law, cut in, her tone flat, like she was reading lines. "Before the guests arrive, please, finish packing." I gave a small smile. "I don't have much to pack," I said. She turned away and went down the stairs, her expensive perfume lingering like a scratch in the air. As I zipped the suitcase, an engine rumbled outside. Evan hurried to the window. "What is that?" he asked. I stood behind him and watched his face change as a long black limo pulled up to the entrance, gleaming. The driver wore a black suit and a felt hat. He opened the door and spoke politely. "Mrs. Helen Montgomery? Mr. Samuel Drake invites you to the car." The room went strangely silent. Brooke glanced at Evan, flustered. "Samuel Drake." Is that the Samuel Drake from Drake Industries? Evan didn't answer. I just pulled my suitcase closer and smiled softly. Seems the nursing home I'm going to is fancier than you thought. I turned and walked out, my wet shoes leaving dark prints on the wood floor. No one came to see me off. No one said a word. The door closed behind me, and I heard the wind tear away their final excuses. The limousine rolled out of the quiet neighborhood where I'd lived for 32 years. Rain streaked the glass like 1,000 silver memories sliding away. I looked out, the lawn where Evan learned to walk, the maple tree Thomas planted the first year we bought the house, the crooked wooden sign, the Montgomerys still hanging by the porch. Everything grew smaller, blurrier, then disappeared. The driver, a man around 50, met my eyes in the rearview mirror and spoke in a steady voice. "Mr. Drake has wanted to see you for a long time." He said, "Mrs. Montgomery will need me someday." I just nodded, eyes on the rain. "He was right," I whispered. We crossed a bridge. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement like a black and white painting. Each turn of the wheels felt like a chapter closing. I gripped the wooden box and lifted the lid. On top was an old photo from the 1977 summer fair. Me in a floral dress, smiling wide next to Samuel, a young man with speaking eyes. I once thought that, if not for Thomas's proposal and my fear of gossip, I would have followed Samuel to California that year. But in life, who can ever know which road is the right one? As the car turned onto the main boulevard, a strange feeling washed over. Me not fear, but release. Sometimes you have to be forced out to realize you've stayed too long in a house where love no longer lives. I leaned my head against the window and looked at my reflection. Silver hair, with a few brown strands left, wrinkled skin, but bright eyes. A 67-year-old woman, not the meek mother, not the compliant wife, but me, Helen Montgomery, about to step into a new chapter. Before I could think more, the driver glanced back. "We're almost there, ma'am." I looked out the window and watched the city lights fade into a tree-lined road lit by warm amber lamps falling across the rain. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome, ma'am. Mr. Drake will be very happy." I nodded slightly, a small smile on my lips. The past I'd buried for decades had just opened its door. The limo climbed a winding road that hugged the hillside, where rows of olive trees rustled in the ocean wind. The salty air slipped in through the cracked window, cool and comforting, like touching an old memory waking up. Ahead, a white estate emerged behind wrought iron gates, thin mist on the walls, large windows reflecting the moon and the silver surf. The car stopped at marble steps. I stepped out and touched the railing, its iron flecked with moss. The driver bowed, his voice warm. "Mr. Samuel is waiting for you in the hall." Sea wind swept in, carrying salt and pine. I pulled my mother's knit scarf tight and drew a deep breath. It had been years since my heart beat this fast, not from fear, but because a part of me quiet for half a lifetime was stirring. The great door opened. Golden firelight spilled across polished wood, and there, framed in the doorway, he stood Samuel Drake. His hair was completely white, but his eyes were warm, deep, steady, just as I remembered. That look was familiar enough to ache, as if 40 years had been a long dream. "Helen," he said it softly, his voice low but full of weight. I froze, my heart catching. He walked slowly toward me, step by step, and opened his arms. Without a word, he held me, not a romantic embrace, but one between two souls who had walked through loss and loneliness and found each other again in the rare peace that age can bring. "I always believed we'd meet again," Samuel murmured, his hand gently squeezing my shoulder. "Whether in a dream or here in this life," I answered with a tired but honest smile. "Maybe we've gone far enough to understand that sometimes life is just a long loop leading us back where we were meant to be." He nodded, his eyes softening. He led me down a hallway floored in oak, past oil paintings hung in neat rows, a seascape, a small bridge, a few black and white portraits. The house was large but not showy. Every corner felt warm and ordered. In the sitting room, the fireplace glowed. Firelight cut clear lines into Samuel's face, every wrinkle, and the calm of a man who had made peace with solitude. We sat facing each other. He poured tea with slow, careful hands. "After my wife passed, I hardly left this place," he said, gazing at the flames. "I don't have children, just work, projects, empty houses. People call me a man who has everything, but Helen, there are things I lost that money will never buy back." I was quiet. There was something true in his voice, a ripeness of sorrow, no longer sharp, just deep. I knew that feeling. I told him my story, without hiding. My husband gone too soon, years of scraping by, the pride of a successful son, then the long slide when that same son threw me out of my home. Samuel listened without interrupting. He just looked at me the way someone looks when they know what it costs to love and be left anyway. "Helen," he said after a while, "it's time to write your own name again. Not behind anyone else's, not just as someone's mother or wife, just Helen, the woman strong enough to begin again." I bowed my head, a warm current spreading through my chest. His words were light, but they felt like a hand pulling me out of the deep quiet I'd lived in for years. Samuel took me upstairs. The room he'd set aside for me faced the sea, with a big window open to wind and salt. White sheets on the bed, a small wooden nightstand with a warm lamp, and a folded note. In bold handwriting he'd written, "No one can steal what you truly deserve." I ran my fingers over the words, my eyes stinging. In that moment, I knew I'd found a place to breathe, not because it was grand, but because here I was seen as a person. That evening, we ate in a small dining room overlooking the bay. The air carried salt and the sound of waves, mingling with the crackle of fire. Samuel spoke about the years he spent building, one structure at a time, deals, failures, people who left. He didn't brag. He talked like he was describing his life, steady, honest, no polish needed. I listened, heavy-hearted. I didn't know why, but the quiet between us made me want to cry. Maybe because it had been so long since I'd sat with someone who would just listen without judgment. When he asked what I wanted to eat, I said, "Just toast and hot soup. I used to eat that in the coldest winters when we were poor, and it tasted like the best meal in the world." He smiled, warmth in his eyes. "Then that's what we'll have tonight." And so the simplest dinner became the most memorable meal I'd had in years. We didn't talk much. We shared glances that said enough old wounds weren't bleeding anymore. They'd become the fingerprints of time. After dinner, Samuel poured me a little red wine. Candlelight played on the glass, on his white hair, and on my hands once swollen from work, now shaking with feeling. "Helen," he said slowly, "I didn't invite you here out of pity. I invited you because I need someone I can trust." I looked up, surprised. "Trust?" He nodded. "I have assets, projects, and I don't want to manage them alone anymore. The people around me only see money. Nobody remembers the meaning of building. But you do. I read a small article about your life years ago, when you fundraised to save your old school from being sold. Someone who can protect a home, a community, can protect a legacy." I said nothing. I'd heard so much doubt and so many orders and criticisms, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be trusted. Samuel looked at me, gentle but firm. "Helen, you once held a family together with your bare hands. I believe you can help me keep what I've spent a lifetime building." I looked out the window, where night covered the sea. The waves hummed against the rocks like an answer. Something lit inside me, small but clear. Maybe it was the faith I thought I'd lost long ago. I smiled softly, my voice tight. "I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I'll try." Samuel said nothing more, just set his hand on my shoulder, light as a promise. That night, back in my room, I opened the window. Ocean air rushed in cold and clean. Moonlight spilled across the floor, shining on the note still lying on the nightstand. I read it again. No one can steal what you truly deserve. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers gripping the blanket. Outside, the waves kept time, like the heartbeat of something in me waking up. I had been a cast-off mother, a widowed wife, a woman forgotten in her own home. But here, on this bay, with the man who belonged to a young chapter of my life, I began to feel truly alive again. When the bedside lamp cast its warm glow on the ceiling, I closed my eyes. The sound of waves, the wind, and a new rhythm in my chest blended together. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, I wanted to wake up and find out. On my first morning at the Bay Estate, light slipped through thin white curtains, stretching across polished wood floors. I sat by the table, listening to waves hit the far rocks, sipping coffee as gulls glided through a hazy sky. The peace felt almost unfamiliar. For years, I hadn't had a morning that didn't start with someone's raised voice or the smell of disinfectant in a house my daughter-in-law obsessed over keeping perfect. Here, I could hear my own heartbeat. But that morning brought a new challenge, too. When Samuel walked into the dining room, he was carrying a thick bundle of files tied with brown twine. He set it in front of me and smiled. "Helen, I think you're ready for a small test." I looked at the stack, a bit startled. "Business plans?" "Partly. A few real estate projects are in trouble. I want to see what you notice. Don't rush, just be honest." He left, and I was alone with the faint, dusty smell of paper. I touched the edge of the bundle, feeling both anxious and curious. It had been a long time since I handled numbers, plans, and columns of expenses. My fingers shook a little, but my mind felt keenly awake. I pulled a chair to the window, letting in the light. The first file was full of land purchase contracts, redevelopment plans, cost estimates. I picked up a red pen and started reading line by line. At first they were just numbers, but soon old memory stirred. I'd helped Thomas keep the books for his small auto shop. I'd stayed up late, adding every line, trimming every cost. Now that feeling returned, like a switch in my brain flipping back on. Hours passed. I forgot lunch. Every time something looked off, I marked it in red. Duplicate vendor payments, consulting fees with no signature, invoices with the same date but suspiciously different amounts. I flagged them all. I also noted clauses that looked risky or lopsided, things I'd learned the hard way with Thomas. By the time Samuel returned, the sky had turned. I was still there, hair a bit messy, red pen in hand, morning coffee cold. He didn't say anything at first. He stepped closer, skimmed my notes, and his expression shifted from surprise to delight. "Plenty of people missed these," he said, "and you caught them in one afternoon." I looked up and smiled lightly. "I just read carefully. When you don't have to appease anyone anymore, your mind works better." He laughed, warm and low. "I'm starting to think I was right to bring you here, Helen." That afternoon he walked me around the back acreage. Below us stretched the bay, blue-green and quiet. A gravel path ran between two rows of olive trees. He told me about the early days projects built with his own hands, long nights on sites, and partners who fell away. When I asked why he kept the company when he didn't need the money, he simply said, "Because it's what's left of me. And now I want you to help keep it standing." I didn't answer right away. I was moved and afraid. An older woman whose hands were used to dusting old frames was being trusted with something this big. The next day, I officially started work. Samuel set up a corner for me in his study, a walnut desk, a new laptop, a lamp with soft golden light. He told me to do things my way. At noon, when I presented my first analysis, a few of his associates, young men in neat suits, walked in. They glanced at me and smirked. One muttered, just loud enough, "So, the old lady's fixing the books?" I just smiled and kept working. Samuel heard it but didn't jump in. He turned to them and said, slowly, "Don't judge someone before you've seen what they can do." I pulled up a spreadsheet and pointed at the lines I'd marked. "Here," I said, "same contractor, same scope, paid twice. Cut the duplicate and cost drop 12%. And here, this contract is missing the third signature, invalid." The room went quiet. They bent over the papers. One frowned and checked the originals. Samuel just stood there, hands in his pockets, smiling. "Mrs. Montgomery," one of them, said, no longer smug, "How did you catch that so fast?" "Because I've looked at rent bills and grocery lists where every number was a meal," I said. "When every dollar once meant food on the table, you don't miss anything." No one said another word. Samuel's eyes were bright. "Helen, your memory is still steel." I smiled, a real smile I hadn't felt in years. The last time someone called me good, Evan was in grade school, waving his first essay. The next days, I worked hard. I woke early, made coffee, opened the window for light, and began turning pages. My brain felt oiled after rust. I wasn't taking orders anymore. I was making decisions. Each mistake I caught, each report I repaired, made me feel alive again. In the afternoons, Samuel often came to the study with cookies or fruit. He didn't talk much. He read the paper beside me, occasionally looking up with a smile, as if he were watching something beautiful he didn't want to interrupt. Sometimes I looked out at the sea. Sunset poured gold across the water. I felt light again, not heavy. That evening, after finishing my first report, I walked the beach. Waves lapped at my ankles, cool and clean. I carried my old wooden box. I opened it. Inside, letters stacked neatly, blue ink faded, the paper gone honey brown. Most were from Thomas when he worked away. At the bottom were a few different envelopes slanted, familiar handwriting. Samuel Drake. I touched one I'd never opened. My heart trembled. I'd kept it for over 40 years, never brave enough to read it. Maybe because I chose a different road then. I opened it slowly, the scent of old paper mixed with sea salt. His hand was still clear, every line careful. "Helen, if you ever need me someday, call. I'll come not to rescue you, but to remind you that you once had wings." I sat for a long time, the wind tossing my silver hair. The sky reddened, and the water glittered like glass. I smiled not out of regret, but because I realized today was exactly the someday he'd written about. Back at the estate, I placed that letter on my nightstand beside Samuel's newer note. "No one can steal what you truly deserve." 2 scraps of paper, one from the past, one from now, lying side by side like 2 steady heartbeats. That night, Samuel stopped by and asked softly, "Were you tired today?" "No. I was just thinking, maybe I forgot what it feels like to be trusted." He smiled. "Good. Believe me, Helen, you never lost it. You just put it away for a while." When he left the room, I turned off the light. Moonlight poured through the window, casting a long shadow across the white blanket. I lay there listening to the distant waves and, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully, not from exhaustion, but because my heart was truly at rest. One clear morning, early sunlight flooded in through the big window, washing over the sheer white curtains. I had just set my coffee on the table when I heard wind moving down the hall, carrying the faint clink of metal from somewhere. I followed the sound, my soft slippers tapping lightly on the polished wood, until I stopped at the edge of the great room. In the center of the room sat a piano under a thin gray silk cover, a light layer of dust on the lid. The wood had deepened with age, the ivory keys had gone slightly yellow, but it still held a classic elegance. My heart pounded. It had been 30 years since I'd touched the instrument that once felt like breathing. When Thomas was alive, after dinner every night he'd sit and listen while I played a few soft pieces. Back then, Evan was little, sitting on the floor, tilting his head with each note, then clapping and laughing. After Thomas died, I closed the lid not because I stopped loving music, but because every sound brought back things I wasn't strong enough to face. Over the years, the piano's voice faded from the house as if it had never been. There. I pulled off the cover. Dust drifted in the sunbeam, glinting like golden threads. I lifted the lid, and my trembling fingers touched the first white key. The sound came hoarse but round, fragile yet enough to make my heart tremble. One key, then two, then three. The old lullaby returned on instinct. I played Edelweiss, the song I used to hum while rocking Evan to sleep. My stiff hands slowly loosened, my fingers finding their way back. The melody was thin, off in places, but it felt like it poured straight into my chest. Each note was a memory, laughter, a little boy calling, "Mom," the gentle eyes of a husband now gone. My eyes filled, and for the first time, I wasn't ashamed of my tears. As the last note faded, I heard a soft sound behind me. I turned and saw Samuel in the doorway, a steaming cup of tea in his hand. He said nothing, just walked over, set the cup on the piano lid, and smiled lightly. "At last, you're letting this house hear a human voice again." I wiped my eyes and smiled, embarrassed. I forgot what it felt like. I thought I didn't have the strength to play anymore. Samuel sat in the chair across from me, his gaze gentle. "Music doesn't forget anyone, Helen. It just waits until you're brave enough to come back to it." His words silenced me for a moment. Maybe he meant the piano, but I knew he was speaking about my life. We sat quietly, listening to the old clock tick. After a while, he set his cup down and said in his warm, low voice, "Next week I have an important meeting with the board. I want you to come." I hesitated. Me? What would I even say? "You see what they don't," he said. Honesty. And the mind of someone who's actually built something with her hands. I need that in a room full of people who only talk about profit. I said nothing, just nodded. Inside me rose a feeling that was part fear, part excitement, the sense of stepping back into a world I thought had left me behind. All the next week, I prepared as if I were walking into my first class. I read every document Samuel sent, marked every point of concern. On a small notepad, I listed 3 priorities: cut duplicate expenses, renegotiate penalty interest, and directly oversee short-term investments. Each night, I stood before the mirror and rehearsed until my voice stopped shaking. On the morning of the meeting, I chose a dark navy blazer, a white blouse, and a small strand of pearls. Not fancy, just neat and sure. When I came down the stairs, Samuel was waiting in the hall in a black coat, his look warm and a little proud. "Ready?" he asked. "I think so," I said, steadying my voice. The conference room was in a glass building facing the sea. When we walked in, a dozen men and women in business attire were chatting. They turned when Samuel introduced me. A few gave polite smiles, a few only nodded. I heard murmurs, "temporary advisor," "an old friend of the boss." Samuel simply rested a hand on my shoulder and said, "Today Mrs. Montgomery will present her review. Listen carefully. Numbers don't lie." I opened the packet and drew a long breath. At first my voice wavered, but as I spoke, I steadied. I pointed to wasteful spending, duplicate charges, and how to reduce bank penalty interest. I avoided heavy jargon, just clear, slow logic. When I recommended changing how we signed contractor agreements, one board member cut in, "With all due respect, ma'am, this field is more complicated than you think." I smiled lightly and opened the appendix I'd prepared. "I understand," I said. "That's why I checked with the company's own legal counsel, who confirmed my recommendation is fully compliant. The supporting documents are here." The room fell quiet. A few bent over the pages. After a moment, the chair nodded slowly. "Reasonable. I agree." No one argued further. I exhaled and sat down, my heart bright, but my face calm. Samuel leaned toward me and whispered, "I told you." You just needed to be yourself." When the meeting ended, people filed out. Samuel stayed and looked at me with that gentle, steady gaze. "Still the woman I remember," he said. "Still strong, sharp, and willing to step up." I smiled. "Thank you, Samuel, but maybe that woman slept for a long time and only woke up today." That afternoon, I returned to the estate feeling oddly lighter and full of energy. In the mirror, I looked different. Not on the surface, but in my eyes there was a brightness I thought I'd lost. I made tea and sat by the window, listening to the bay. The sun was sinking slowly, casting an amber glow across my cup until the surface shimmered. I thought of Evan and Brooke, and a vague sadness rose. How long had it been since they called just to ask, "How are you, Mom?" My phone buzzed on the table. A text lit the screen. It was from my daughter-in-law, Brooke. The words were short, cold as metal. "We've decided to sell the house. The contract is being signed, just so you know." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing the curtains and blowing sand across the steps. Inside me, there was no trembling, just a slow, clear cold spreading out. I set the phone down, stood, and walked to the window. From where I stood, the sea was rough, the sky darkening, gusts of wind salty on my lips. I took a deep breath. No more tears. No more pleading. I whispered to myself, soft as the breeze. If they think they can take everything, they don't understand that what I have now can't be measured in bricks, money, or walls. I closed the window. Inside me, a flame caught quiet, but firm. Tonight, I knew I wouldn't be the woman who only endures anymore. I sat by the window as the sea breeze gently stirred the white curtains. In my hand was my phone, the screen lighting up with the name of an old friend, Martha Green, a retired attorney I'd known since my husband was alive. We'd volunteered together for a community housing nonprofit. I called her, keeping my voice steady. "Martha, I need a favor. I want to check the property records under the name Helen Montgomery, my house in Portland. I need to know its legal status." On the other end, Martha hesitated, then spoke softly. "Helen, do you suspect something?" "No suspicion. I just want to know if anyone else has laid a hand on what should be mine." After the call, I sat in silence for a long time. The waves kept their rhythm, but it felt like a storm was forming inside me. I wasn't angry or sad, just cold in a way I hadn't felt in years. A feeling that had once died was back in a different shape. Absolute clarity. 3 days later, Martha called back. Her voice was formal now, no longer familiar. "Helen," I checked the records. "The house is no longer solely in your name." "It's not?" I asked, strangely calm. "Evan Montgomery filed a mortgage and forged your signature. The contract was executed just 2 days before you left." I gripped the receiver and said nothing. Outside, a gull cried once and vanished into the sky. "I can send you copies," Martha said. "The forgery isn't even subtle. Anyone who knows your real handwriting would see it." "Thank you, Martha. Send it as soon as you can." I hung up, my hands resting flat on the table. Dim light came through the glass and fell across the wood, tracing every old scratch. In that moment, I realized I no longer wanted to cry. Maybe those tears had run out with all the other hurts. What remained was an icy quiet, the quiet of someone who doesn't need revenge, only the right moment for justice to speak. That afternoon, an envelope from the law office arrived at the estate. I opened it, the soft rasp of paper, the scent of fresh print mixing with sea air. The first line was clear: "Mortgage certificate no." At the bottom was my crast: forged, signature tilted, unnatural, a shaky imitation. The date, 2 days before I was thrown out. I set the file on the table, stared at it, then wrote in the margin, "Not angry, just cold." When Samuel walked in, I was still there, eyes on the page. He looked over my shoulder, read a few lines, then set a hand on my shoulder. "Evan?" I nodded. Yes, he didn't just throw me out, he tried to sell my memories. Samuel was silent for a moment, then said, low and sure, Helen, justice doesn't come on its own, you have to call it with your own hands. I looked up at him. In his eyes, I saw myself in the mirror, no more shaking, no more haze, only resolve. I know, Samuel, I said, but I don't want to drag them to court. I want them to understand the cost of what they did without a judge's verdict. He raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. So what do you plan to do? I didn't answer right away. I took the small brown notebook I'd carried since leaving Portland, flipped to a blank page, and wrote one line, "The lesson will be served at the dinner table." Samuel tilted his head. I have a feeling something interesting is coming. I closed the notebook and spoke evenly. They told me to leave at a fancy dinner with their friends. Maybe it's time I invite them to the last Montgomery family dinner. Samuel chuckled, his eyes lighting up. You're not striking back, Helen. You're teaching them a lesson in cause and effect. I smiled and kept my eyes on the sea. There's no law fairer than a meal seasoned with the truth. Just a dinner, but the main course is awakening. That night, I called the estate's private chef, John, the gentleman who'd worked for Samuel for over 20 years. I asked him to prepare a big dinner for 8, with red wine and classic American dishes Evan used to love, New York-style roast beef, buttered mashed potatoes, and cinnamon apple pie. John looked a little surprised. Expecting special guests, Mrs. Montgomery? Very special, John. A reunion after many years. I asked him to set the table on the terrace facing the sea. Crisp white tablecloths, white lilies in crystal vases, tall golden candles. It needed to be elegant, not to show off, but to give history a proper stage when it was retold. The next morning, I wrote the invitations by hand, thick navy cards with silver embossing, simple and refined. I took my pen and formed each letter carefully. Dear Evan and Brooke, family reunion celebrating a new beginning. Venue, Drake Bay Estate. Time, Saturday, 7 p.m. Dress code, elegant. I read it once more, closed the card, and smiled. Just a few lines, enough to spark curiosity and, if I guessed right, a little quiet dread. Samuel leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded, watching me write. You want them to think this is a peace dinner? No, Samuel. I'll let them decide what it is. People are most afraid when they don't know what's waiting. He stepped closer, picked up the card, and smiled. Family reunion celebrating a new beginning. Short, tasteful, and enough to keep them restless. Exactly. I don't need to shout or accuse. I just need them seated in front of me, under candlelight, when the truth is served like the main course. Samuel chuckled with a hint of admiration. Helen, you're one of the few people I've met who doesn't need revenge, just order. I shrugged lightly. No one needs to be punished, Samuel. I'm only inviting them to share the consequences they cooked. By late afternoon, as the sky turned amber, I got a confirmation. Brooke had read the invitation. 2 words. Will come. I looked at the screen, calm, with the smallest smile. I knew what they thought, that I felt guilty, that I wanted to reconcile, that maybe I needed them back. They didn't know they were the guests about to be, and served the truth. That evening, Samuel and I reviewed the mortgage file again. He arranged the documents neatly into a black envelope and set it in the center of the desk. Are you sure you want to put this on the table during dinner? He asked. Yes. Justice doesn't need a courtroom. It belongs at a dining table where people once lied, laughed, and betrayed. That's where it will hurt, but that's the pain people remember. Samuel nodded, his voice softening. Helen, are you afraid they won't handle it? I looked him in the eye, the light reflecting in his pupils. I don't want them to suffer. I want them to wake up. He laughed, half sad, half warm. You really aren't like anyone I've known. You don't want to win, you want to teach. Maybe because I've already lost everything, Samuel. When you've touched bottom, you don't need revenge. You just want to witness the truth rise. Outside, the sun sank into the sea. The sky went deep red, reflected in the glass of the wine he'd poured. I lifted my glass and touched his. "What are we toasting to, Helen?" he asked. "To the dinner ahead, and to the main course called The Truth." Samuel laughed, low and rich. I have to say, I've never seen justice served so gracefully. I set my glass down and looked toward the cracked window. The wind picked up and sent a few papers flying. In the afterglow, the mortgage pages spun and fell like broken wings. I bent to gather them, folded them carefully, and said quietly, "Wind just makes things visible. Sometimes the truth needs a strong gust." Night fell. The steady hush of the bay rose under the clock's slow chime. I looked in the mirror and saw an older woman with silver hair looking back. No fear, no tears. Only the calm of someone who understands every betrayal leaves a mark, and every inkstroke can stand as a witness for justice. Tomorrow, I'll send the invitations. And then, I'll wait. The entire day, the Bay Estate felt charged, quiet, prepared, taut like a string about to sing. At dawn, John and the kitchen staff set the terrace table where the sunset could pour gold across the water. I gave them details. Spotless white cloth, slim taper candles, white lilies in crystal. Everything clean, simple, formal, like a rite. I chose a floor-length navy dress with a high neckline and 3/4 sleeves. Not showy, but just right for someone who no longer bows. On my chest, I pinned my mother's silver brooch, the only keepsake I had left through all the storms. Its cool gleam matched the steady resolve inside me. Samuel stepped in from behind in a light gray suit, deep blue tie, and a white pocket square. He looked at me for a moment and nodded. "Perfect. You don't need any weapon but your composure." I smiled. "And the truth, Samuel, tonight that's the main course." He chuckled softly and offered his arm. I took it, and we walked onto the terrace. The sun was dropping, copper light sliding across the sea, turning the terrace warm bronze. The table was set, 4 places, wine glasses sparkling, the ocean providing the soundtrack. At exactly 7 p.m., the crunch of tires on gravel sounded at the gate. I didn't turn. I heard quick footsteps, and then the butler's voice from the hall. "Mr. Evan Montgomery and Mrs. Brooke Montgomery have arrived." I drew a slow breath and tightened my fingers on the table's edge. The wooden door opened. Evan entered first, white shirt, pale blue tie put together, like he'd come to negotiate. Brooke followed in a red dress, bold lipstick, rings catching the light. Both wore thin smiles, tailored for polite encounters. "Mother, what a surprise to be invited," Brooke said sweetly, though her eyes searched the scene. "It's been too long since we've shared a meal," I said, calmly pouring wine, "and I think every family needs at least one dinner to see who they're really sitting with." Evan glanced around and stopped at Samuel. "And you are?" Samuel smiled politely and shook his hand. "Samuel Drake. I'm partnering with your mother on her new work." "New work?" Evan frowned. "I didn't think my mother was still working." I just shrugged. "There are many things I thought I couldn't do anymore, Evan. Then I learned them again. Just like you, isn't that right?" The words drifted out gently, but I saw his eyes flicker. Brooke lowered her gaze, fussed with her glass, and gave a small laugh. "Either way, it's nice to see you in good spirits, Mother. This estate is impressive," Samuel answered, light as a breeze. "Yes. But the most impressive thing is its new owner." Brooke paused, and Evan turned to me, brow creasing. "New owner?" I didn't answer. I just signaled for John to start serving. The meal moved along politely, but the tension was so thick you could hear the knife lightly tap the plate. I watched every expression, the way Evan tried to look composed, the way Brooke kept glancing around, eyes measuring, weighing. They still didn't understand. When the main course arrived, Samuel set down his wine glass and cleared his throat. "May I say a few words?" he began, voice low but clear. "I want to thank Mrs. Montgomery, who in a short time helped me straighten out the company's finances, uncovered a string of violations, and brought in significant profit." Brooke looked up, lipstick print still on her glass. Evan raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair. Samuel went on, each word slow and measured. "For that reason, as of today, I am officially handing over full executive control of Drake Holdings to Mrs. Helen Montgomery." The only sound was the faint crackle of the candles. For a few seconds, the room held its breath. Then Brooke choked, red wine spilling over the rim and splashing the tablecloth. Evan shot to his feet and knocked his chair over. "What? No way!" Samuel didn't respond to him. He turned to me and smiled calmly. "I think you should say the rest." I stood, smoothed my dress hem. Candlelight threw my shadow long across the tiles. I took a black envelope from my coat pocket and set it in the middle of the table, next to Brooke's dessert plate. "I invited you here because I want you to see something. Not a will, not a gift, but a piece of paper that speaks plain." Evan glared at the envelope, irritated. "What are you trying to pull now, Mom?" "Just read, Evan." I slid the envelope toward him. Inside is a copy of the mortgage on the Portland house, with my signature. Actually, no, a forged signature. The air went heavy. Brooke shot Evan a look, her face draining. "What are you talking about? Who would forge your signature?" I looked at her, my tone soft but cold. "Whoever wrote it rushed, Brooke. The letters shake, the Helen is too light, and the cross on the tint in Montgomery is wrong. Martha, your father's former attorney, confirmed it. The contract was filed exactly 2 days before I was thrown out of the house." Evan flushed, his voice cracking. "You're slandering me." "I didn't." "You didn't what, Evan?" "I'm not saying you committed a crime. I'm saying I learned the law." I opened the envelope, pulled out the notarized copy, and laid it on the table. The black letters were crisp in the candlelight. No one spoke, only the surf outside, the wind slipping through the railing, and the candles hissing. Brooke forced a smile, trying to steady herself. "If this is the game you want, we'll call the police." I met her eyes, voice as even as a calm sea before a storm. "Not tonight, Brooke. Tonight there's no police, only a mirror." She bit her lip, leaned toward Evan, whispering. But he sank back into his chair, pale. I knew, in that moment, he realized every exit had closed. I went on, quiet but clear. "It's taken me years to understand there are two kinds of people in life, those who build homes with bricks and those who sell them with a signature. I used to think love could redeem greed. Now I know only the truth can." No one added a word. Samuel poured more wine and looked up at me. Candlelight warmed his eyes, proud, kind. "I've never seen justice served at a dinner table with such grace, Helen." Evan stood, shoved his chair aside, voice unsteady. "Let's go, Brooke." Brooke rose too, heels striking the stone floor with a cold echo. They left quickly down the hall. When the wooden door closed, sea wind rushed in, tilting the candles so their light washed across my face. I looked at the closed door, not sad, not glad. Just lighter, as if I'd finally put down a stone I'd carried half my life. Samuel turned to me, his voice low and weighted. "Dignity just beat the noise." I smiled. "Sometimes silence is the loudest cry, Samuel, and tonight, I believe, they heard it." The offshore wind carried salt through the thin curtains, clearing the smell of wine and the leftover tension. I looked out to the water where waves followed one another in the moonlight. There, I saw the figure of a silver-haired woman standing steady, not needing power, not needing revenge, only needing to own herself again. 3 days after that dinner, the sea still looked like lead, but inside I was quietly at peace. The last candle had burned down on the table, and with it, a heavy part of my heart went out too. I didn't think they'd come back, at least not soon, but life always finds a way to make people face themselves. On the fourth afternoon, I was reading in the sitting room when a soft knock sounded. John stepped in, a little hesitant. "Mrs. Montgomery, there's a man at the gate. He says he's your son." I set the paper down, a small pinch in my chest. I knew this day would come, but it still felt like hearing an old song whose first note could still catch my lined breath. "Let him in, John." The door opened. Evan stood there, the man who once was my pride. Now his shirt was wrinkled, hair unkempt, face hollow. The pride in his eyes was gone. All that remained was the exhaustion of someone who'd been through a very long night. "Mom," he rasped. I was wrong. I stayed quiet for a long moment, then said only, "Knowing you're wrong is the start, Evan, not the end." He bowed his head, fists clenched. I heard the weight in his breathing, the stir in his chest. Then he spoke, bit by bit, voice breaking. "Brooke," she pushed me to sign for quick loans. She said it was the only way to keep the house because the bank was about to foreclose. I was afraid of losing face, afraid the neighbors would find out, so I agreed. "When I signed your name, I thought I'd fix it later. I thought I could control it." He stopped, rubbed his forehead, voice catching. But then everything spun out. "When you left, I knew I hadn't just lost the house. I'd lost myself." I listened without interrupting. Some pain doesn't need emphasis. When he looked up, his eyes, for the first time in years, held a little honest light. "Mom, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to start over." I looked at my son, feeling both strange and familiar. In that bowed posture, I saw the boy who once followed me through the market, clutching my shirt so he wouldn't get lost. Slowly, I asked, "What does helping you mean to you? Letting someone else decide your life again, or teaching you how to stand up straight?" Evan bit his lip, silent. In his eyes, I saw real regret, but missing one thing: responsibility for himself. Right then, Samuel walked in, folder in hand, voice steady. "John told me we had a guest. This might be a good time to hand this over." He set the file on the table and slid it to Evan. "This is a 6-month trial contract with my technical development fund. The job isn't glamorous, but it demands discipline. It's a technical assistant role. Pay is enough to live on." Evan opened the folder, then looked up, startled. You want to hire me?" "No." Samuel smiled. "Your mother wants to give you a path. I'm only opening the door. Whether you step through is up to you." He turned to me, eyes wet. I answered evenly, clear. "If you make it 6 months' work seriously, no lies, no quitting, we'll talk again." Evan bowed his head low. He didn't cry, just nodded. "I understand." "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Mr. Drake." I nodded back. "Thank you isn't enough, Evan. The world doesn't change because you apologize. It changes when you do things differently." He was quiet, then stepped out to the veranda. Sea wind tossed his hair. Before he left, he turned back and said softly, "One more lie, you won't have to throw me out. I'll walk out on my own." I watched him go without anger. Only a tired kind of love mixed with a small hope, the kind only a mother has patience to keep, even after it's flickered out many times. Samuel sat beside me and poured hot tea. "Do you believe he'll change, Helen?" I smiled faintly, eyes on the water. "I don't know, but I know I did the right thing. When someone hits the bottom of shame, there are only 2 choices: collapse or stand up. I choose to believe my son will stand." Samuel said nothing. Then he laid his warm hand over mine. "You're not just strong, you know when to stop. Maybe that's the difference between those who want revenge and those who want healing." I turned and smiled. No one wins with hate, Samuel. The only winner is the one who can sit down, pour tea, and say, "Now do you understand?" He nodded. Rain began tapping the roof out over the bay. I looked through the window. The first drop slid down, pulling 1,000 others with it, as if the sky were letting go of something heavy it had held too long. That night I lay in bed listening to the rain against the glass. Unlike other nights, I wasn't cold, and I wasn't afraid of being alone. In the warmth of the blanket, I thought of my son, of Samuel, of the old house, and of myself. Some losses are never replaced. But some wounds, if you face them straight on, seal themselves with patience. I didn't know how far Evan would go, or whether he'd hold the job for 6 months. But I knew the door I'd once slammed was now just mostly closed, and if one day he found the courage to knock again, I'd listen but I wouldn't rescue. That's what grown love is. The next morning, sunlight flooded the dining room. Samuel was reading the paper, coffee steaming. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "You look lighter." "Maybe because I finally set a stone down," I said. "I don't have to carry it everywhere anymore." I sat, pulled a small desk calendar from my coat pocket, and wrote in blue ink, slow and steady. "Respecting others starts with respecting yourself." I taped the note to the wall near my desk, looked at it for a few seconds, and smiled. Outside, the water flashed silver. Waves kept hitting the shore, patient as a mother, gentle sometimes, fierce sometimes, but never done waiting. I lifted my cup and took a sip. As the warmth spread, I felt truly at ease, not because everything was over, but because I'd come back to myself at last. In the months after, I stepped into a season I never expected. From a mother kicked out of her house, I became a managing partner of a major investment fund, the company Samuel had spent half his life building. It felt both foreign and familiar. Foreign because I'd never pictured myself in that seat. Familiar because the work made me feel alive. Every morning I got up early, opened the window for sea air, and breathed deep. On my desk were reports, contracts, and notes I'd prepared the night before. Samuel gave me full authority to review ongoing projects. I didn't have fancy degrees, but I had the experience of someone who once stretched every last dollar, and that care became my greatest strength. Within 2 weeks, I flagged 2 high-risk projects, a lakeside resort and a hotel in another state. I urged a sell-off before prices fell. Samuel looked hard and nodded. "If you're right, just exiting these 2 could save us more than $8 million. I don't care about the number, Samuel. I care about stability. People lose their peace chasing faster gains." He studied me for a long moment, a mix of surprise and respect in his eyes. "Helen, I understand why people trust you. You're not here to take more, you're here to keep what matters." The call proved right. 2 months later, the resort got hit with environmental violations, and the hotel lost its permit. Drake's fund avoided losses and raised net profit by 18%. Investors started paying attention to Mrs. Montgomery, the older woman with the sharp mind who could see beyond the numbers. A local business paper ran a short piece with my photo by a window full of documents. The headline read, "The Woman Who Turned Stability into Strength." I just smiled. If they knew I'd been thrown out by my own son, they might have titled it, "From Front Porch to Boardroom." One afternoon, Samuel came into my office with a folder, calm but serious. "Helen, I've thought it through. I want you on all financial signatures." I looked up, startled. "You mean co-sign?" "Yes. I trust you to carry it. I don't want decisions resting on one person. This company needs both mind and heart, and you have both." I went quiet, then said softly, "Samuel, I don't want power. I want transparency. That's exactly why you deserve it most." He set the co-signature authorization on the desk. I looked at his signature above the bold letters. Drake Holdings, co-signature authorization. When I signed, my hand trembled, not from fear, but feeling. Sometimes fate jerks your life off course, but if you're resilient, you take the wheel back. That afternoon, the phone rang. John transferred the call, voice low. "Someone named Evan Montgomery would like to speak with you." I closed my eyes. Over 4 months had passed since we last met. When I picked up, all I heard was tired breathing. "Mom, I'm sorry to bother you again, but Brooke is gone." My grip tightened. "Gone?" She took everything I had left: savings, credit cards. I've got one account, but she can access that too. "Mom, I have nothing." Evan's voice shook. There were no excuses, no blame, just the emptiness of someone stripped of illusions. "Where are you?" I asked. "At the job site warehouse. I'm afraid to go back to my room." I sighed. "All right, come to the Drake Fund office tomorrow at 8 a.m. See Samuel. Don't talk much. Listen. Got it?" "Yes." The next morning, Evan showed up on time. Same old shirt, faded jeans. Samuel met with him first, explained the work, then called me in. Evan stood when he saw me, no bowing, but a different look in his eyes. No defensiveness, just acceptance. "I have nothing left to say, Mom. I just want to work if you'll let me." I sat and met his eyes. "Evan, I'm not saving you this time. You're going to save yourself. 2 choices. 1, report everything honestly. Work with the attorney to handle the debt and pay back what you can. 2, walk away from everything. Me, the company, this life, and don't come back." He was quiet, then nodded. "I'm staying. I'll take responsibility." I looked to Samuel. He smiled and gave a small nod. "Then, welcome to the first chapter of your real life. We don't need the best people here, we need the honest ones." All morning, Evan worked under a site engineer. I stayed out of it. From a distance, I watched my son in the shop, taking notes, wiping sweat, listening with his head down, a sight that made me ache and feel grateful. Finally, he was learning from the ground up. That evening, Samuel and I sat in the study, planning the fund's next steps. He set down his cup, voice low. "Helen, you once said you wanted to help older people exploited by their families. Maybe it's time." I looked at him, something rising in me. "I've thought about that a long time, Samuel. A fund that doesn't just give money but gives a voice to those who've been silenced." I opened my notebook, scribbled, then read aloud. Dawnlight Foundation. Mission: protect and support seniors who suffer financial abuse, coercion, or loss of property rights. Samuel repeated the name and smiled. "Dawnlight. Sounds like you light after the night." I smiled too, a warm feeling lifting in my chest. "Dawn doesn't come from magic, Samuel. It comes from those who keep the flame through the night." He nodded and pulled out prepared documents. "Here are the papers to establish the foundation. If you truly want this, we can sign tonight." I took the pen, fingers trembling not from pressure but from feeling. As the last line dried, it felt like I'd closed a chapter where pain was a wound and opened one where pain became light. Samuel rested his warm hand on my shoulder. "Helen, you just built something bigger than justice. You built a chance for people who thought they had none." I looked at him and smiled. Outside, the sun had set, but a band of pink still glowed along the horizon, quiet, persistent, breathtaking. Softly, almost to myself, I said, "Maybe this is what I was meant to do. Not strike back, but light the way for those who were deceived." As the room lights dimmed, I laid a hand over my heart, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. I was no longer the one looking for a place to stand. I was the one helping others stand. In that moment, I knew my life had finally turned onto the road I should have taken long ago, the road of dawn. That February, the sea breeze eased, sky clear and gentle. I remember that morning sunlight through thin clouds, laying a soft gold over the house. Samuel usually rose earlier than me, brewed tea, and read by the window, But that day, when I stepped into the kitchen, there was no kettle whistling, no jazz playing like he did each morning. I called softly, "Samuel?" No answer. I went upstairs. His door was ajar. Light fell across his face, peaceful, kind, with a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. He lay on his side, one hand over his chest, like he was dreaming something light. The air held a trace of jasmine tea, the kind he drank every night. I stood there a long time, feeling a space open inside me, not loud, not shattered, just a silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. I moved closer and took his hand, cool now, the hand that had signed so many documents, and rested on my shoulder like a true companion. I spoke very softly, afraid to disturb his peace. "Samuel, you brought me back to myself. Thank you for coming, for seeing me, for teaching me that some beginnings arrive at the end." I sat with him until the sun leaned west. There were no tears. Just the strange warmth of a parting that was whole, with nothing left unsaid. A week later, we read the will at Samuel's attorney's office. A small room, walls lined with files, soft yellow light. I sat in the middle, Evan beside me, and across from us Mr. Clarkson, the longtime attorney. He opened a sealed envelope and read in an even, steady voice, "I, Samuel Drake, being of sound mind, set forth this will. All assets, shares, and managerial rights to the Dawnlight Foundation are to be transferred lawfully to Mrs. Helen Montgomery. She is not only my associate but the person I trust to carry on the ideals we began." He paused, then continued. "Mrs. Montgomery has full authority to manage, utilize, and distribute assets as she sees. I fit within the law. I trust she will know what is right." The room fell silent. I said nothing. No joy, no pride, just a heavy sense of responsibility. Samuel was gone and left me more than assets. Duty, continuity, and a reminder that when you're trusted, you must live worthy of it. Evan had been quiet. Then, like a wave finally breaking, he jumped up. "No, no way. Mom's not fit to hold that money." I turned to him, calm. "Why not, Evan? Because I'm old? Or because I won't be controlled by you anymore?" He bit his lip, voice cracking. "Samuel was your guy. You manipulated him, I stood and walked toward him. "Remember what you said once? Your house doesn't belong to you. Now you say, this money doesn't belong to you. It seems your whole life you've denied the work of others." Evan took a step back, face blanching. Are you throwing me out, Mom?" I breathed out, voice as light as wind through a curtain. "No, I'm returning the lesson. Now get out of my house, Evan." The room went still. Mr. Clarkson bowed his head slightly and stayed out of it. Evan stood there a few seconds, then turned away, shoulders shaking. The door closed, leaving the scent of oak and the faint echo of fading footsteps. I sat down in the chair, looking at the wooden desk where the envelope with the will still lay. Among the thick stack of papers, I saw a small sheet folded in half, set aside, unsealed. On the outside was Samuel's familiar handwriting, "For Helen after I'm gone." I opened it. Inside were only a few short lines. "Helen, if you're reading this, it means I left without getting to say goodbye. Don't cry. I'm leaving with a peaceful heart, knowing you'll stay and do what's right. But remember, don't forgive too soon and don't forget how strong you are, Samuel." I held the paper in my hands, the letters trembling as if they were breathing. A tear fell not from sadness but from gratitude. I smiled softly, wiped it away, and murmured, "Classic Samuel with the last words, hurting and healing at the same time." That night, I lit a candle on the table facing the sea. A light breeze made the flame tilt, its reflection flickering in my eyes. I whispered as if speaking to him, "You left the way you chose, light as a breath, unburdened. I'll carry on what you left behind because I know you believed light doesn't go out when a person disappears, it just changes direction." I looked out the window at the shimmering night sea. Each wave seemed to carry away a piece of the past, leaving the surface calm. In that quiet room, I felt something rare, complete peace. The next day, I went to the foundation office and sat at Samuel's desk. The pen he always used rested neatly in its holder, next to a stack of unfinished files. I opened the first page and saw his blue ink handwriting. Every elder was once a pillar. Helping them isn't charity, it's restoring their rightful place. I closed the notebook gently and smiled. Maybe that was his final greeting and the compass for the rest of my years. Evan didn't come back that day. Maybe he needed time. I wasn't angry anymore. I only hoped that when he saw Samuel's legacy used to help the vulnerable, my son would understand. Wealth isn't for owning, it's for lighting the way. That evening, I returned to the room he used to sleep in and lit another candle. Its glow washed over the photo of us at the Dawnlight Foundation opening. I placed my hand on the glass and said softly, "Rest easy, Samuel. The dawn goes on, and I'll keep the flame until it reaches everywhere." A sea breeze slipped through the open window, tilting the flame like a nod. I smiled. Tonight, I didn't feel empty anymore. Because I knew you're still here, in every light we kindled together. That afternoon the rain fell thick like a silver curtain across the sky, the sea blurred in the damp haze, the waves steady rather than fierce, like someone tapping softly beneath the surface. I sat by the office window, reviewing the budget draft for the Dawnlight Foundation, listening to rain strike the glass. This time last year, I was on an old wooden chair, watching Evan and Brooke laugh in the house I used to call mine. Same rain, but then it was bitter cold. Today, there was only quiet in my heart. A light knock sounded. John, the house manager, stood in the doorway, a bit uneasy. "Mrs. Montgomery, there's a woman at the gate. She's soaked and says she needs to see you." I set down my pen, frowned slightly. "Who is she?" John hesitated for a beat, then said, "She says her name is Brooke." The room seemed to pause. I went still, my heart tightening for a moment, not from fear, but surprise. That name had once been a cut across my heart, and now it was knocking. I nodded. "Bring her to the sitting room. Towels and hot tea." When I walked in, Brooke stood near the fireplace, thin in a drenched coat. Her hair was matted, makeup streaked, dark circles under her eyes. Mud clung to her shoes, and her worn bag looked like it had been hauled from a dumpster. No trace remained of the woman who smirked at fancy parties and barked orders at me in my own home. She looked up when she saw me. In that hesitant gaze, I saw the shame of someone who had finally learned her true place. "Mrs. Helen," she said, voice shaking. "I'm sorry to come without calling. It's raining and I have nowhere else to go. I'm just asking to stay a few days, until I can find somewhere new." I looked at her and said nothing for a few seconds. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the rain on the porch. I remembered clearly the day she stared down at me from the steps, with that flat smile and a line cold as steel. "Your medicine smell ruins the party. Best you stay in your room." I didn't blame her. No need. Life had arranged a more precise lesson for her than anything I could say. I went to the table, poured more hot water into the teapot. The steam rose with the soft scent of licorice and honey. Then I spoke, steady. "I don't have a spare room, Brooke, but I do have a piece of advice, the very one you gave me. Start over on your own." She lowered her head, hands clenching together. I used to think you were weak. When you were quiet, I thought you were scared. When you left, I thought you lost. I didn't understand." I smiled gently, neither angry nor pitying. "Silence isn't weakness, Brooke. It's patience. And patience, sooner or later, collects its debt." She looked up, eyes brimming. "I've lost everything, Mrs. Helen. Evan's gone, I'm broke. Friends turned their backs, I have nothing." I studied her for a long moment. Maybe for the first time in her life, Brooke wasn't hiding behind lipstick or pride to cover the emptiness inside. I said softly, Losing everything isn't the scary part, Brooke. The scary part is learning nothing after you lose. She said nothing more. She just nodded, set the teacup down, and turned to go. As she stepped through the door, a gust of sea wind slammed it against the frame, a sound like a final period. I watched her figure fade into the rain. No gloating, no triumph. Only lightness, as if the last shadow of the past had lifted from my threshold. Near dusk, I put on a coat and walked the beach. The rain had let up. The sun peeked weakly through heavy clouds, tinting the water silver gray. I walked slowly, letting the sand give under my feet, letting the wind tug at my hem. The ocean didn't make me sad anymore. It simply reminded me everything can be washed clean. I thought of the faces that had passed through my life, Evan with his remorse, Samuel with his gentle smile, Brooke wandering in the rain. Each one its own chapter, and me, the only one left to write the final line. When I returned, the house was lit. John brought the first-year budget file for the Dawnlight Foundation with a note, "All numbers verified. You only need the final sign-off." I sat at the desk, hand brushing Samuel's familiar pen. Outside, the wind still blew, waves hitting the rocks. I opened each page: donations, aid programs, legal training plans for seniors. Every figure, every line felt like a small vein pulsing inside a new body, the thing Samuel and I built together. I reached the last page, the signature line for the executive director. Below the bold print, Helen Montgomery, founder and director, I drew a breath, signed, then added a small handwritten line, "Never reopen the door that once threw you out." I sat quietly, watching the words dry under the desk lamp. In that moment, I didn't feel like the wounded or the victor. I felt free, real freedom that comes when you no longer need anyone else to prove your worth. Outside, the rain stopped completely. Far off, the final thunder rolled and dissolved into the sea. I closed my eyes, letting that sound blend with my breathing like a song of release for both past and present. I whispered, to myself and to Samuel, if he was listening somewhere, in the end, everything's where it belongs. Those who left, and the one who stayed. Lightning flickered on the glass. Wind moved through the olive trees, leaves rustling like applause for a peaceful ending. I turned off the lamp, closed the file, and let the sea air fill the room. Now, everything was truly calm. No more rain, no more blame, no more nagging voices in my head. Only me, Helen Montgomery, the woman once pushed out of her own home, now sitting in a bright room, signing off on the last truths of a life: self-respect, freedom, and peace. Spring came later than usual. The sea breeze wasn't bitter anymore, just carried a little salt and the smell of wet grass after the night rain. I sat on the porch with a steaming cup of tea, watching the first daffodils bloom. After a stormy 10-year, the house finally understood what quiet meant. I was about to stand when the gate knocked. John went to open it. From a distance, I saw only a tall, thin man in a silver-gray coat, wind pushing his graying hair back. He walked slowly, leaning on a wooden cane, slightly listing as if he might fall. When he drew closer, I realized it was Evan, the son who'd thrown me out, who called me a burden. Now he stood before me, a shadow of himself. His skin was pale, eyes sunken, breath short and shaky. His hand shook on the cane, but his eyes, for the first time in years, held only the truth. Before I could speak, he knelt on the steps, voice rough. "Mom, I'm sorry. Not for money, not for the foundation, not for the past, for you." I stood still. Time stopped. Spring rain misted his shoulders, ran down the hand gripping the cane. I stepped closer, bent down, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Evan, get up. The wind's cold." He looked up, tears mixing with the rain. In his eyes, I saw the boy who once clutched my hand crossing the street, who laughed loud at his birthday cake. I said, voice thick but steady, I can't forgive all of it yet, son. But I still love you. I always have." He nodded, sobbing. Then he told me, in broken pieces, like each word was an open wound. "After Brooke left, I lost my job. I tried to borrow to reopen the shop but got scammed. The debt piled up, friends avoided me. I drank a lot to forget, but nothing went away. Every time I sobered up, all I saw was your face the day I threw you out. It kept haunting me." I listened without interrupting. "Some pain only grows louder if you speak over it." When he finished, I stood and went to the kitchen. I brewed a pot of green tea, poured 2 cups, and set one before him. "Drink, warm up first, we'll talk after." He took the cup, still shaking, eyes wet. I sat beside him, watching a small candle flicker in the draft. We said nothing more. The silence between us wasn't a wall anymore, it was a fragile bridge. When the clock struck 9, I asked John to make up the sitting room for him. He tried to thank me, voice weak. I just smiled and pulled the blanket up to his chest. "Sleep, Evan. It's cold tonight. Don't open the window." I don't know when I fell asleep. I only know that in the morning, when the first light touched the curtains, something felt different. The house was unusually quiet. No sounds from John in the kitchen, no footsteps. I walked downstairs. The sitting room door was ajar, the curtain moving in the draft. Evan lay on the sofa, blanket to his chest, his face strangely peaceful. I called softly, "Evan, time to get up. I made tea." No answer. I stepped closer and touched his cheek. Cold. Everything around me seemed to stop. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I knelt by my son, held his limp hand, and whispered, "Rest now, Evan. You finally found peace." Outside the window, the clouds broke and warm sunlight fell across his face. Maybe heaven was kind, giving him one last warm morning. I sat with him a long time, until John called the doctor. They came and confirmed it with a solemn nod. No one cried, no need. I knew this was how Evan chose to end, quietly, without noise, without another mistake. His funeral was simple. No expensive flowers, no speeches, only the sea for music. I buried him in the garden behind the house, where you can hear the waves each morning. A small stone, carved with only Evan Montgomery's son, not perfect, but loved. When the mason set the stone, the sea breeze picked up, carrying salt and sand into the air. I stood and held tight to the small notebook Samuel once gave me. Let the past be a lesson, not a shackle. Evan was gone. But in his leaving, I didn't feel empty. I felt understanding. Understanding that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it turns it into something lighter, like rain washing dust away but leaving the mark of earth. Understanding that true love isn't holding someone here, it's letting them rest when they no longer know how to stand. When everyone left, I stayed alone. The sea was calm, the water stained with sunset. I set down a white bouquet, touched the cool stone, and said softly, "I forgive you, Evan. Not because you deserve it, but because I need peace." Then I went home. The house held its breath in silence. I closed the door, hung up my coat. In the mirror, the woman looking back wasn't a widowed mother or an old woman cast aside. She was a survivor of hurt, of time, of herself. I sat at the table, poured tea, and listened to the kettle's soft whistle. Outside, the waves kept working the shore, patient as ever. Slowly, I wrote in my journal, "Forgiveness doesn't make pain vanish. It makes us strong enough to look back without shaking." I set down the pen and looked out the window. The light was pulling away from the water, leaving a thin gold line along the horizon. I closed my eyes and breathed deep, letting the salt air fill my lungs. Inside, nothing was heavy anymore. Only a gentle, empty space where memory and the present could coexist in silence, like two waves touching and fading so the sea could be smooth again. I knew that from today on, no one would be knocking with debt or regret. Only me, and the soft sound of a life that had closed, peacefully. This morning, I opened the door to Samuel's old office. The room still held the scent of jasmine tea, new paper, and the oak he loved. Sunlight poured through the window onto the desk, where he'd spent hours reading my reports. I dusted each drawer and shelf, then set his photo beside the Dawnlight Charter, two symbols of wisdom and kindness, still side by side like loyal friends. On the wall behind the desk, I hung a new frame. Elders the foundation had helped one woman reclaiming a stolen home, one man recovering a pension that had been abused. Each face, each smile, proof that justice can come late, but it comes. My work is simple now. In the morning, I meet those who need help. They bring tangled stories, thick folders, and eyes edged with fear. I listen without judgment. Many bow their heads as they speak, as if afraid of being laughed at. I just hold their hands and say, "I've been there. Trust me, we can walk out together." In the afternoon, I play the piano. Not for anyone, not for an audience, just to give sound back to myself. Notes drift through the wide room and blend with the waves outside. Some songs I played when Evan was young, others no one's heard. The music isn't sad or happy, just peaceful. Sometimes I think back to the first days when Evan and Brooke pushed me out, when I stood in the rain with a suitcase and a broken heart. But now I understand. They didn't throw me out of a home. They pushed me toward freedom. Freedom doesn't arrive with cheers or victory. It arrives when you realize you don't have to prove anything anymore. When you live kindly, quietly, and still hold your head up through loss, that's the most elegant revenge. I sat at the desk and opened my worn journal. On its thick pages, my handwriting runs like a heartbeat. Rainy days, stormy nights, other people's stories, and my own. On the last page, I wrote the final line, slow and clear. My name is Helen Montgomery. I am standing tall. I set down the pen and drew a deep breath. Sea air swept in through the window, carrying the tang of salt and the cry of gulls. I threw the windows wide so the breeze could billow the white curtains. Everything felt both real and light and beautiful. Far out, lights on the bay began to blink, small boats coming home after a long day. That glow felt like a signal to those who've fallen. There's still a shore to return to, still a tomorrow to begin again. I smiled gently at Samuel's photo and whispered, "Samuel, I did it. Do you see? The sea is calm today." A strong gust came through. The candle on the desk leaned, and then steadied itself. I knew if he were here, he'd just smile and say, "Told you you're stronger than you think." I closed the journal and watched the sunset dissolve over the water. Time had taken much, but it returned the most precious thing, quiet in my soul. No more resentment, no more what-ifs, only the present, full and enough. If you've listened this far, maybe you also have a Helen inside you, a part that's been hurt, misunderstood, pushed out of a place you once called home. If my story made you think of your mother, your father, or yourself, tell me where you're watching from and what you would do if you were pushed out of your own home. I truly want to hear your story, even if it's just one line. Thank you for spending time with my journey, a regular woman learning to rise after loss, to forgive without being weak, and to smile when the past knocks. If you believe resilience, honor, and renewal still have a place in this world, leave a comment, tap like, subscribe, and stay with me. At any age, we can begin again, love again, and stand tall as ourselves. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and if you listen closely, somewhere out there, the sea is still singing with me.